All right, does that look good on your end?
That's great.
Great, all right. So as Quinn said, my name is Sarah, and I'm an attorney with the nonprofit animal protection organization, Animal Equality. And I'm gonna be talking to you guys today about the need for legal protections for farmed fish. So yeah, if you have questions, as Quinn said, I'll be happy to answer those during the Q&A part of this event. So I'll start just by giving you a little bit of background about animal equality. Our mission is to work with society, governments, and companies to end cruelty to farmed animals. And we are an international organization. I'll give a little bit of history here. We were founded in 2006 by Sharon Nunez, Jose Valle, and Javier Merino in Spain. And when they founded the organization back then, we really did not resemble an effective altruist organization at all. Early actions included shock tactics to gain media attention. For instance, here you can see two of our founders in 2006 with a couple other activists chained themselves to the entrance of a slaughterhouse in Madrid. So those sort of more direct action type tactics. And although animal equality has always been highly focused on issues impacting animals raised for food, in the early years, the organization protested numerous animal rights issues that are generally not thought of as being EA issues, so to speak, due to the relatively small number of animals involved in the industries. So for instance, use of animals in circuses or clubbing seals at zoos, bullfighting. Of course, with those industries, we're still talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of animals, but those numbers really do still pale in comparison to the number of animals in agriculture, which is why kind of slowly over the first decade of animal equality's existence, the organization began putting more and more of its focus on farmed animal issues. And finally, in September 2015, decided to make the official shift to exclusively focus on farmed animal issues. And the statement on our website about this strategic shift basically says, as an organization, we want to make sure that our resources are being used to end the worst forms of animal suffering and to help the greatest number of individuals. So that, of course, speaks to the philosophy of effective altruism. So as I mentioned, we are an international organization. At this point, we have offices in 8 different countries. So there's Spain, Italy, Germany, the UK, Mexico, Brazil, India, and the US. Our US operations began in 2014. Here are our main focus areas. So we're probably best known for our undercover investigations, which we use to create change through educating the public. Some of the images that are captured by our investigators are then used to create these virtual reality experiences, which we call iAnimal, and those are deployed all over the world, including to volunteers. And we actually will hand those out to volunteers who want to do events with them. So at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a little more information about how to volunteer if you're interested. But in addition to public education, we engage with companies to try to make change happen at the corporate level, convincing companies to adopt various welfare standards, for instance, for their procurement. We also do some food policy work in some of Animal Equality's countries, not so much in the US at this time, but our sister organization in Latin America, Alianza Alimentaria, which works to increase plant-based food options in various settings, for instance. And then, of course, there's legal advocacy, which is what I work on. And that is what I'm going to be speaking to you about today primarily, especially in the context of farmed fish. So here's an outline of what I'm going to be talking about throughout this presentation. I'll start by identifying exactly what types of issues we're talking about when we say farmed fish need legal protections. What types of legislation would we like to see and on what issues? Why do we care in the first place? So what is some of the science behind fish welfare, the scale of the problem, and then current fish farming practices. How do we get this done? What is the tractability issue? We'll talk about that. And where that goes to tractability to a very large extent. And as I'll explain, probably the most hopeful jurisdictions would be in Europe and the US. Asia is also going to be an incredibly important place to start working on these issues, although it'll be tricky. And then, like I said, I'll circle back to ways that any of you can get involved if you're interested. So what types of issues would we like to focus on through legislation? And a big one is welfare at slaughter, and the sine qua non of humane, quote unquote, slaughter is effective stunning. And we'll talk about what that looks like for fish. Also, environmental enrichments are incredibly important for any farmed animals that are confined in especially really industrial sort of conditions. Housing standards such as minimum space requirements and water quality, and then standards around humane handling, and then feed composition all go to welfare. So starting with slaughter, some of the laws that currently exist that regulate slaughter, humane slaughter of farmed animals, include the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act in the US, which, as you can see, has been around for decades. And that law it refers to livestock. However, the definition of livestock is very limited, as I'll talk about in a moment. In the EU, you have these council regulations to protect animals at the time of killing. You can see the language here is more or less the same. The goal is the same. There are more species that are protected under the EU regulations than the US law. And then anti-cruelty laws at the state level in the US and various other countries, as well as at the domestic level in various EU member states, also go to slaughter and tend to only really be relevant for the most egregious abuses. And that's because the anti-cruelty laws really only prohibit, quote, unnecessary pain or suffering. And when it comes to, commercial enterprises, they would claim that a lot of their practices are necessary. And so we get into a little bit of trouble there. So here are some of the problems with the existing laws and why we really need some improvements in this area. I mentioned in the US, they only a few species are covered, and poultry and fish are excluded from that. That means essentially that 99%, probably over 99% of all the animals that are slaughtered for food in this country are not protected under Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. In the EU, fish are also excluded, although poultry are included. So there's a difference there. And then I mentioned that the anti-cruelty laws tend to, they tend to exempt common agricultural practices, either specifically by saying so, or as I just mentioned, they will only make it a crime to cause unnecessary suffering. And as I said, agricultural producers will often say that they're practices that would be cruel if you were to treat a dog or a cat that way are nevertheless not a crime under these laws because they're necessary. The other problem with this, of course, is that it gives all the power to industry to essentially write the standard into law that they find convenient. So if a practice is especially cruel, even if it's, even if it is generally considered egregiously cruel, if the industry kind of decides, nope, this is going to be a common practice, then by the plain language of the law, it's not going to be a crime. The good news, of course, is that laws can be amended. Now, it's not necessarily an easy task, but it has been done and it can be done again. Of course, the animal agriculture industry is incredibly powerful and has very, very high paid lobbyists. So this makes any sort of legislative change for farmed animals really quite difficult. But given the number of animals that are impacted by this industry, it's a fight that is is definitely worth having. So a little bit more specific to aquatic animals. How are farmed fish typically killed? When you consider the methods that are used in common practice today, in the absence of these humane slaughter requirements, you can see that there are a lot of really unpleasant methods that are used. And some of the most common ones include live chilling, which involves the fish being taken out of water and placed in an ice slurry, where they slowly die of lack of oxygen because they're out of the water. And this is especially problematic for fish that have adapted to survive in cold waters, because they can survive with a very low metabolism and amount of oxygen, which actually just prolongs their death. So we would love to see that method outlawed, as well as all of these other ones. I mean, any of these things, if performed on a terrestrial species, would be illegal. So, you know, as I'll get into, the moral and logical consistency is to provide some of these protections for fish. And there are options for effective pre-slaughter stunning. Percussive stunning and electrical stunning are the two methods that are currently used for other types of species. Percussive stunning tends to be used for larger species, whereas electrical stunning is more common among the smaller species like poultry, some pigs, whereas cows and pigs tend to be stunned using both of these methods. One uncommonly used method, but that is the subject of growing research, is the use of anesthetics, which can be used in conjunction with either of these other methods just to calm the animals down before they're handled and stunned, or they can actually render the animals unconscious themselves. And so using a food grade anesthetic would mean that the animals, especially fish, where if this would just be added right to their water, and it wouldn't make the resulting meat at all unhealthy for humans. And so, yeah, this product exists, but is not in widespread use yet. So we'd love to see more of that. That's about the best practice. So enrichments, as I mentioned, are another area that is really important when it comes to the welfare of farmed animals. I'll just briefly talk about some enrichments that are legally required for other species. There are currently no enrichment requirements for farmed fish. In the EU, for instance, there are these council directives that lay down different standards for different species. They tend to be pretty vague. So if you look at this example I gave for pigs, it just says that they need to have access to different materials that enable proper investigation and manipulation of their environment. And it really doesn't specify what that means. So once again, anytime you're giving the industry the power to kind of come up with their own standards or definitions, they tend to be lacking. There's really not much in the way of enrichment requirements for farmed animals in the US, with the exception of a few states that are starting to pass laws, enrichment requirements for hens kept in the egg industry. And those laws, they all are pretty identical in these 6 states so far. There may be one other that I'm forgetting, but I think it's just these 6. And they prohibit the use of cages and require these various housing features that enable the birds to engage in more natural behaviors, which is incredibly important for their welfare. And so why is enrichment important? There's a number of reasons. So it reduces stress, first and foremost, which in turn reduces aggression among different animals and reduces injury and poor psychological welfare. It also improves, to a certain extent, it improves the animal's commercial performance, which from a welfare perspective isn't what our organizations tend to be too worried about, but it is a good talking point to convince producers to and legislators to enact these requirements. So these same types of arguments could be used for making enrichments for farmed aquatic species required. And what types of enrichments might we ask for? Well, there's a whole variety here that kind of gets into the nitty gritty, but basically all sorts of considerations that account for fish's different biological and psychological needs. So including structures that they can interact with and hide in and around, proper environment where they can engage with each other in a safe and non-stressful way, and all of these different things. But again, these are not legally required anywhere at this point. Some other issues that might be legislated for aquatic animal welfare include housing requirements like maximum stocking densities. As you can see from this photo, this is not atypical. It's completely unnatural the way that a lot of these fish are stocked in on fish farms. The goal is maximum profit, and so the more individual fish you can cram into an area, the better in terms of your bottom line. And so that's why we really need some sort of requirements when it comes to limiting stocking density. Otherwise, you would just end up with this situation here. And total swimmable volume is also an important consideration, as well as regulations around humane handling, feed composition, parasite control. You can see, for instance, with regard to parasites, they pose a huge problem, especially in dirty, densely stocked ponds, or any other form of farmed fish confinement. In this photo, you can see there's sea lice, and lice are very common in farmed fish operations, and they are incredibly painful to the fish, but there's not a great solution for getting rid of them. So it's an issue that needs further research and regulation. Although this presentation is about farmed fish, it's worth noting the connection with wild caught fish, because a lot of really popular species of fish that are farmed, for instance, salmon and trout, are carnivorous, which means that they need to eat other fish in order to survive. And the smaller fish that end up being turned into fish feed for the farmed fish tend to be caught in the wild. And the methods that tend to be used for catching small fish like anchovies and other small-bodied species are incredibly environmentally destructive and also lead to their own host of welfare problems, including fish that are crushed under the weight of other fish in the nets. They can be killed from depressurization as the nets, haul them up from the depths of the ocean, leading to some really gruesome circumstances. I won't go into detail there, but you can Google photos of what happens to a fish that's depressurized too quickly, along with, again, asphyxiation and other really, really inhumane types of situations. So that is the what. Lots of issues to be solved. And why should we even put resources into coming up with these solutions and passing laws to ensure these protections are in place? And the biggest reason is that fish are sentient. The science on that is very, very clear at this point. The other is the scale aspect. The number of individual animals that are impacted in this industry is extraordinary, in 100 billion plus, and then that number jumps up to the trillions if you count the fish that are caught to be turned into fish feed to feed the farmed fish. So it's an incredibly inefficient system. But the point is that the scale is truly massive. The other reason is that current practices, as I'm going to explain, are really, really bad. Not to put too fine a point on it, but without regulation, operations that are just trying to maximize profit are engaging in practices that are just incredibly egregious. And then there's also environmental impacts that overlap with welfare considerations. And have probably heard, if you've seen Seaspiracy or any of these other documentaries that are out there, there's a lot of problems that come along with fish production, whether it's wild caught or farmed. And as I just said, there's actually significant overlap. So what does the science say about fish sentience? Basically, it says that fish are sentient. They feel pain, they feel stress, they experience fear. I'm sure everyone has heard at some point. I remember when I was a little girl, my dad took me fishing and I was upset by the notion of a hook going in the fish. And I remember being told, oh, don't worry, fish don't feel pain. So somehow that became a common misconception, but the science is now very clear on the fact that, oh, indeed they do. So critics of fish sentience, and that the pool of critics dwindles by the day, but they tend to focus on structural differences between the brains of fish and other animals. But the fact is that through something called convergent evolution, different species can develop the same functions through completely different anatomical structures. And there's plenty of evidence of this from other groups of animals that have the same brain function served by very different structures in their brains. So one good example of this is actually crows and other corvids, which many of you may have heard are incredibly intelligent, despite actually lacking some of the same cognitive structures that humans rely on for our higher order thinking. So that's a good example of how a lot of these traits like intelligence and certainly the ability to feel pain, fear, and stress, which have a direct advantage to a species to keep them alive, that ability is present in fish. And I just appreciate this quote by Dr. Webster. He's basically addresses what I was told as a little girl directly. The claim that fish do not feel pain just can no longer be called a scientific statement, given the weight of evidence that we now have. So in terms of numbers, again, talking about scale, I mentioned it's estimated that there's somewhere between 73 and 180 billion individual farmed fish at any given moment. And this number is projected to increase. It has already overtaken wild capture fisheries. And so more fish, it's pretty even right now, but this trend is expected to continue. So more fish will continue to suffer in farmed operations. And as I mentioned again, the wild caught fishing will actually continue to ramp up in direct proportion to fish farming due to this practice of catching smaller fish from the oceans to then feed to farmed fish. So the other thing is what's interesting to me is rather striking is just that there are so many individual animals impacted in this industry that they're counted almost exclusively in terms of weight, not individual animals. So that's why the estimate in terms of number of animals impacted is really hard to pin down. That's why I said 100 billion plus, somewhere between 73 and 180 billion. But animals are measured in weight as opposed to numbers, just because of just the sheer number of them. And that, of course, further devalues them as being worthy of welfare considerations. So that has its own problems. So another big why do we want to regulate this, comes from some of the things that have been discovered through undercover investigations. So I'll talk about a few. Animal Equality has in the past year or so released 2 different investigations at fish slaughterhouses. And then I'll talk about one other investigation that a different group did. But as you'll see from some of the practices that I describe, which are almost, for the most part, almost all legal, we really have some legislative work to do here. So Animal Equality last year released an investigation at a salmon slaughterhouse in Scotland. And the investigator filmed workers operating an automatic stunning device. It automatically stunned and then cut the gills of the salmon, but it was poorly calibrated, which means that many animals were seen displaying consciousness after the failure to stun. as evidenced by flapping, wriggling, and various gasping motions, which again would be completely unacceptable by any other animal welfare standard for any other species. Their gills were frequently cut without stunning, and their gills are incredibly sensitive, so that causes them severe pain. They were often re-stunned with a club manually, but only after their gills were cut, which caused blood just to spray everywhere and also completely defeated the purpose of pre-bleed stunning. The stunning was just so poorly administered that salmon were often clubbed multiple times, in some instances as many as 7 times. Some workers cut the fish's gills with their fingers rather than a scalpel, again, incredibly painful for them. And on a couple occasions, the animals, large numbers of the fish would fall off the machinery and onto the floor, and they were just left there to suffocate over many minutes and sometimes even hours. Another fish slaughter investigation that Animal Equality recently released was at a catfish slaughterhouse. This is in Mississippi. And again, some of the findings just are egregious. Fish there are commonly left on the slaughter line on these conveyor belts during employee breaks. And this picture really kind of illustrates, you can see how they took off the gloves and they went on lunch break. And that could be up to 45 minutes, even an hour. And the fish were just left there suffocating during this time. And the other problem had to do with stunning, or lack thereof, rather. And it meant that most of the catfish were beheaded while still conscious. And although they were stunned to a point, like the purpose of that was just to immobilize them and not to render them unconscious. So most of the fish were not actually administered an electrical current that was sufficient to render them unconscious. So they're basically just paralyzed, but fully conscious, which is, again, a welfare problem that would not be tolerated for other species. So as I mentioned, conscious fish were seen beheaded. Also, turtles and rejected fish were placed into buckets. Because there are these big ponds outside of the slaughterhouse that the catfish were raised in, they attracted turtles. So turtles were being brought into the slaughterhouse constantly, and they would have to be picked off the line, and they would just be put in buckets. And the problem is they would be ground up alive, and according to one employee, they would often be used as feed that would then just be fed back to the catfish. So we're talking about catfish being fed to catfish and turtles being ground up alive. I mean, it's one especially horrible scene that the investigator captured was a turtle that was put onto a moving conveyor belt carrying severed catfish heads. It sounds like a horror film. And the turtle was like desperately trying to crawl in the opposite direction as it was moving towards the macerator. It was really, really heart-wrenching. So all of these practices that raise huge welfare red flags. This is the other undercover investigation that has been done at a fish farm. You're spared images this time because we didn't, this one was not conducted by Animal Equality, but a different group. And then it was at this massive fish factory farm called Cook Aquaculture in Maine. Again, some of the things that were discovered are just egregious, throwing fish, trying to complete trick shots with their bodies, cruelly killing them by slamming them on the ground. I mean, you guys get the point. I won't belabor this. It's really upsetting. But one thing that was really just amazing about this investigation is that they discovered that some of the fish that were coming from this operation were then marketed as high welfare under this brand True North. So, I mean, we have multiple levels of issues going on then. And yeah, the big reason why we need to focus on this is because there's just no enforcement. Either the conduct that our investigators documented is not expressly illegal, as in on the salmon farm in the UK, or law enforcement refuses to take any action, as in which is what happened in the Mississippi catfish plant. Um, or in Maine, the conduct is arguably illegal under their anti-cruelty law, but there's just simply no mechanism to enforce it. So why have a law if you can't enforce it? Which is why we need legislative solutions. And some of the steps that we are currently taking and other groups are taking on this front is really to start, we need to build some groundwork. I have had some meetings with lawmakers where I raise this issue, and I've had several tell me like, look, I'm going to be honest, I've never thought about this in my entire life. And it's not surprising, right? People barely think about where their food comes from as is. And certainly when it comes to where fish products come from, people don't even know that fish factory farming exists. So educating lawmakers, responding to government consultations. There have been some opportunities to do that in the UK and in the EU. So we can provide some of our expertise on these issues as the government actually starts to consider regulating in this space a bit. And then simultaneously trying to get some traction with corporations to get them to commit to sourcing fish ingredients that come from higher welfare operations. And then that in turn creates motivation for legislative change. We've seen that in the meat chicken industry and the cage-free egg industries as well. And so all of these preliminary steps are going to help with the tractability issue, which is admittedly the trickiest of the three cause prioritization components, because like I said, it's just an unfamiliar issue to a lot of people. And then there's a lot of misconceptions around fish. Again, still people who don't think that fish can feel pain. So a lot of education is needed. But really, when it comes to assessing tractability, it depends on where and what issues we're talking about. So probably requiring effective stunning before slaughter would be the one single issue that has the greatest chance of getting enacted. And that's because the technology exists already for a lot of the most prevalently farmed species. And then also just the moral and logical consistency of the argument. You know, if we have these welfare laws for other sentient farmed animals and fish are sentient, why don't we have welfare laws for them? But then the other consideration is to get traction in legislatures, sometimes you need broad coalitions. And so one approach that we're taking here in my home state of Oregon is to work with a broad coalition of NGOs to put together a regulatory package that addresses not only fish welfare, but also some environmental considerations and food safety issues, all of which kind of tie together in the aquaculture context. And why there's hope, I mean, again, the technology already exists, and there are some very, very strong logical and legal and moral arguments for why this should be put in place. And honestly, the industry has some operations are already doing some of these things on their own volition, and that is because there are some profitable reasons for doing it. So I mentioned mostly, I think these issues are going to be the most tractable in the UK and EU, just based on some murmurings we're hearing, and the fact that, like in the UK, the ministry with authority over farm animal issues there has indicated an interest in extending what they call WATOC protections. It's welfare at the time of killing regulations, which fish currently are excluded from, but the UK ministers are talking about promulgating some regulations for humane slaughter of fish. Like I said, there's some efforts ongoing at the state and federal level here in the US, but they're early days. But so we're really just doing groundwork building here. And then I mentioned the importance of looking at these issues and legislative opportunities in Asian countries, which are, historically have been neglected by the animal welfare, especially farmed animal welfare movements. But the reality of the situation is that Asia is home to 90% of fish farms. And that number is rapidly increasing even. The other thing to consider is that although right now carp is the most commonly farmed fish in Asia, carnivorous species are increasingly being produced there, which once again raises concerns about the impact on wild fish populations, given the need to catch smaller prey species of fish to then feed to the farmed fish. So there's all the environmental concerns that come along with wild capture fisheries as well. So if any of you are moved to get involved in this work, of course, none of our work would be possible without donations. So we always welcome that. There also are volunteer opportunities. I mentioned, the iAnimal virtual headsets that we will send to people to then table with them, although I'm not sure what the current status of those activities are because of COVID, but that, in normal times is an option. We also have other volunteer opportunities that you can get involved with just from home. And then of course, replacing fish and other animal products with plant-based alternatives is going to make a direct impact as well. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
All right.